Okay, so, as a philosopher, you're always thinking about these big questions, right? Like, what is existence? How do we know anything? Is there some kind of divine out there? Well, today, we are really diving deep into the world of Moses Maimonides.
A really influential figure from the 12th and 13th centuries.
Exactly. And his thought was like totally immersed in the Islamic philosophical tradition of that time.
Okay.
Now, you've given us a ton of material to work with here.
Yeah, it's pretty extensive.
So our mission, our big goal today is to try and unpack some of the most important philosophical ideas for you, especially how Maimonides connects with these key Islamic thinkers.
And I think it's worth pointing out just how wide-ranging Maimonides' interests and writings really were. He really was a polymath in the truest sense. I mean, you look at his work, and it covers physics and Jewish law,
Oh, yeah?
theology, politics, psychology,
Wow.
biblical interpretation, philosophy, medicine, you name it. He probably wrote something insightful about it.
So to really get the nuances of his philosophy, we need to kind of understand the world he was living in, right? That whole intellectual scene.
Absolutely. I mean, you can't just read Maimonides in a vacuum.
Right.
To grasp the complexity and the depth of his thought, we need to immerse ourselves in that 12th, 13th century Islamic context. Recognize the influence of Greek philosophical traditions and Islamic traditions really prevalent in his time.
Okay, so as a philosopher yourself, ideas don't just sort of pop up out of nowhere, right?
Definitely not.
They build on what came before. So to understand Maimonides, we can't just read him in isolation. We need to see him as part of this much larger conversation that's been going on for centuries.
Precisely. And to help illuminate this rich intellectual heritage, we're going to be focusing on a handful of pivotal Islamic thinkers, figures whose impact on Maimonides is especially significant.
Okay, great.
So these include the thought-provoking theology of Aristotle,
Okay.
as well as the influential philosophers Al-Farabi, Avicenna, Al-Ghazali, and Averroes, really major figures in Islamic thought.
These are giants, really, who had a huge influence on the course of Western philosophy. Now, while other thinkers obviously played a role, focusing on these five should give us a really clear picture of some of those major intellectual through lines connecting them to Maimonides.
Exactly. It's about tracing those lines of influence, seeing how ideas get shared and transformed as they move across time and cultures.
It's fascinating, really. So how can we make this exploration, this dive into these interconnected ideas, sort of tangible and really relevant?
Well, a good way to do that is to look at specific examples, concrete cases where we can see these connections in action. So we'll be examining really instructive passages, key examples from Maimonides' masterpiece, The Guide of the Perplexed, and then we'll juxtapose those examples with parallel ideas, similar concepts, or sometimes even contrasting viewpoints that we find in the writings of these prominent Islamic thinkers.
So side-by-side comparisons to really bring out those connections and those differences.
Exactly. This kind of comparative approach, I think, is the best way to highlight how deeply interconnected these philosophical traditions really are. It's not just about Maimonides, it's about a whole web of thinkers engaging with each other across time and space.
That's a really great approach. I'm excited to get into the specifics. Now, you mentioned Shlomo Pine's Translator's Introduction to the Guide, a pretty significant work, right? But as a philosopher, I know that interpretation is always an ongoing process, always evolving.
Yeah.
So Pines gave us a great starting point, but it's not the final word on Maimonides, is it?
Of course not. Pine's An Introduction is an invaluable resource for anyone trying to really grapple with Maimonides. He meticulously traces those Greek and Islamic sources that were so influential for Maimonides' thinking. However, you're right, scholarship doesn't stand still.
It's constantly evolving.
Exactly. And over the years, there's been this growing consensus among scholars that the influence of certain figures, notably Averroes and Al-Ghazali, on Maimonides might have been more direct and even more substantial than Pines initially proposed. So it's a more complex picture than we might have initially thought.
It seems like the more we learn, the more we realize how intricate these connections really are.
Exactly. And the timing of these influences, when exactly Maimonides encountered these different thinkers, is a really key point of scholarly debate. It's like a puzzle, trying to piece together all these different fragments.
Exactly. And this is where the detective work really starts, isn't it? Especially with Maimonides, because he wasn't always so explicit about who he was engaging with.
Right. You're absolutely right. Maimonides was this incredibly well-read scholar, deeply steeped in the philosophical discussions of his time, but he rarely cited his sources directly. He was more subtle than that.
It's like he expected his readers to be familiar with the works of all these other philosophers and to pick up on those subtle references and allusions.
Yes, and that presents a real challenge for us as interpreters because we have to be extra attentive to these unspoken dialogues that are happening beneath the surface of the text. It could be agreement, a subtle critique, a reinterpretation of all sorts of possibilities.
It makes it really challenging, but also very rewarding, I think, to try and unpack all of those layers of meaning. Now, as a philosopher, you're also interested in the bigger picture. And it seems like Neoplatonic ideas, these concepts of emanation where reality flows from this single divine source and this idea of the radical transcendence of God, they're both really central to Maimonides' thought.
Absolutely. And these concepts were also very prominent in the Islamic intellectual world that he was part of. The idea of a hierarchical unfolding of reality, originating from a singular divine source, the notion of God as utterly beyond human comprehension, these were central concerns in both contexts.
So these ideas were kind of floating around in the intellectual atmosphere, so to speak.
Exactly. They were part of that shared intellectual vocabulary that thinkers like Maimonides and his Islamic predecessors drew upon.
Okay, so I'm already starting to see how important it is to understand that historical and intellectual context to grasp the world that Maimonides was living and thinking in. And you included a really thought-provoking quote from Lawrence Durrell via Kramer, "We are the children of our landscape." Really emphasizes that.
It's so true. Kramer makes a really compelling case that to genuinely understand this period, the key players, the ideas they were grappling with, you absolutely have to engage directly with Arabic sources.
So reading those sources is like stepping into the intellectual landscape of that time, seeing the world through their eyes.
Exactly. And it's crucial for understanding Maimonides because he was part of that world. His ideas were formed and debated against that specific backdrop.
And Stromsa adds a really important point by reminding us that Maimonides was this incredibly erudite scholar who didn't always name his influences.
Right. He wasn't always dropping footnotes.
Right. So as interpreters, we need to look beyond those explicit citations. It's like trying to understand the roots of a massive tree when all you can see are a few branches.
A great analogy. Stromsa's point highlights the need for us to be really careful and sophisticated in our interpretations, recognizing that Maimonides' philosophical knowledge was likely far, far more extensive than those direct references might suggest. There's this whole world of potential influences and dialogues happening beneath the surface of the text.
All right, I think we've laid some really important groundwork here. Context is key. We have a focus on those specific Islamic thinkers, and we're ready to delve into the guide. So where do we start seeing these significant Islamic philosophical influences in Maimonides' work?
A natural starting point, I think, for someone like you accustomed to tracing those intellectual lineages is to examine that broader Islamic philosophical backdrop, the intellectual landscape against which Maimonides developed his own philosophical project.
That makes sense.
And perhaps a slightly surprising starting point is the theology of Aristotle.
Okay, the theology of Aristotle, attributed to Aristotle, but so deeply rooted in Plotinus. It's fascinating, isn't it, how ideas get transmitted and transformed over time? It really is. So this text, likely compiled sometime in the 9th century, possibly shaped by Al-Kindi's intellectual circle, had a huge impact on both Jewish and Islamic philosophers. It's one of those works that really shaped the philosophical framework that Maimonides would later engage with, alongside other key Platinian-inspired texts in Arabic, such as the Kalam Femo al-Khair.
So kind of a bridge between the ancient Greek world and the flourishing Islamic intellectual world of Maimonides' time. So for a philosopher interested in the core tenets of a school of thought, what are some of the key Neoplatonic ideas from the theology of Aristotle that resonate within Maimonides' own system? What kind of jumped out at you?
Well, several core ideas come to mind. First and foremost is the profound concept of God as an absolute unity. God is simultaneously pure goodness and pure being itself. This is fundamental.
It's like the foundation upon which everything else is built. Exactly. And then, flowing from that foundational idea, we have the concept of God as the ultimate creator, the primary cause of all existence. And a third crucial concept, the notion of emanation, this idea that reality unfolds, or you could say, emanates from God.
And how does that work?
Well, in this model, it starts with the intellect, then soul, and then nature, kind of a cascading series of emanations. Now, it's worth noting that this is a slightly modified version of Plotinus's original scheme, where God wasn't just above being and intellect, but was actually identified with the highest level of being itself.
So they're taking Plotinus and sort of integrating a more maybe Aristotelian understanding of God as also possessing intellect.
Exactly. You've got this fascinating fusion of different philosophical traditions happening here, which allowed thinkers like Maimonides to conceive of God as this utterly transcendent being in his absolute unity,
Okay.
but also as the ultimate source and ground of all existence. It moves beyond Aristotle's primary focus on God as just the unmoved mover, the cause of motion, to something more.
Okay, so the theology of Aristotle, you're saying, it also presents this idea of creation as a form of emanation, flowing from God's inherent goodness. How does that play out in Maimonides' work?
This is a really crucial point, especially for understanding Maimonides' language when he talks about these things. In his intellectual context, terms like creation, even the idea of creation ex nihilo, often carried this strong implication of a kind of eternal emanation, a continuous, eternally flowing act of God bringing existence out of his own essential goodness.
So it's not just a one-time event that happened in the past.
Right. It's an ongoing process. It's woven into the very fabric of reality. And this idea, which has roots in Plato's idea of the unjealous God in the Timaeus, really underscores that inherent generosity and overflowing nature of the divine.
I can see how that would be appealing to a philosopher who's grappling with the idea of an absolutely perfect and good God.
Absolutely. And the theology of Aristotle even goes so far as to suggest that God creates without the need for conscious thought or deliberation, which in a different context might sound strange.
Yeah.
But here it's meant to emphasize just how fundamental creation is to God's very being. It's not like a separate act of will. It flows directly and eternally from his boundless goodness. And we see echoes of this idea even in Avicenna's more Aristotelian description of God as pure intellect.
So where creation still occurs in virtue of his very essence.
Exactly. It's not through some kind of deliberative process, at least not in the way we normally think about it.
So we've talked about this kind of broad philosophical backdrop, the ideas that were in the air, so to speak. Now, what about those other key thinkers, those big names we mentioned, Al-Farabi, Avicenna, Averroes, and Al-Ghazali?
Yeah.
How do they fit into Maimonides' intellectual world? What's their relative importance for someone trying to understand his work?
Well, I think for someone interested in those direct lines of intellectual influence, Al-Farabi really holds a place of honor for Maimonides.
Okay.
He cites him more frequently in the guide than any other Islamic thinker, which suggests a really deep and sustained engagement with his philosophical ideas. Al-Farabi was one of the earliest and most influential figures in this tradition, laying a lot of the groundwork for those conceptual frameworks that Avicenna and Averroes and others would later build upon. So to understand them, you really need to understand Al-Farabi.
Okay, that makes sense. Now, what about Avicenna? Because I know Maimonides had a kind of complex view of his work, right? He wasn't always completely on board.
That's right. Maimonides explicitly states in a well-known letter that he considered Al-Farabi's philosophical insights, quote, more profound than those of Avicenna. So he clearly had a preference there.
Yeah.
But even in that criticism, even when he's pushing back, Maimonides acknowledges Avicenna's intellectual subtlety, the rigor of his arguments, which I think shows that he still considered Avicenna's work worthy of serious study and engagement. He might not have agreed with all of his conclusions, but Avicenna was undoubtedly a major figure in his intellectual world, shaping the conversations he was part of.
Okay, so respect for Avicenna, but maybe not full agreement. Now, how about Averroes? For someone interested in these historical dialogues, the question of when Maimonides actually encountered Averroes' work is really fascinating.
It's a crucial question. There's still a lot of scholarly debate about that. Pines, for instance, argues that Maimonides likely didn't have direct access to Averroes' more extensive writings until after he'd finished the guide. But other scholars, like Harvey or Straume, point to some pretty intriguing resonances of Averroes' ideas within the guide.
So maybe some indirect influence or even the possibility that Maimonides encountered some of Averroes' earlier works.
Exactly. And Straume goes even further, suggesting that the guide can be read, at least in part, as a direct response to Averroes' emerging philosophical project. So even if we can't definitively pin down the exact nature and timing of their interaction, it's clear that Averroes is a figure whose relationship to Maimonides' thought needs careful consideration. They're clearly in conversation with each other in some way.
Okay, so the relationship between Maimonides and Averroes is still something of a mystery. but definitely worth exploring further. Now, lastly, Al-Ghazali. As a philosopher, I'm obviously familiar with his critiques of philosophical inquiry, his concerns about the potential dangers of reason when it's divorced from faith.
Of course, he was a major figure in that debate. And while Pines thought that Maimonides probably knew about Al-Ghazali's ideas just through the general intellectual climate, other scholars have pointed to some more specific parallels between their works, both in terms of language and in the way they approach certain philosophical issues.
So maybe more than just a general awareness of his ideas.
Exactly. Some scholars see Ghazali's fingerprints, so to speak, in Maimonides' discussions of creation,
Oh,
or in his use of certain evocative images. Some even suggest that the very title of the Guide of the Perplexed itself might be a nod to Ghazali, who described God as the guide of the perplexed. And Strumza points out that Al-Ghazali had a massive influence on the Almohads, the ruling dynasty under whose authority Maimonides lived and worked. So even if Maimonides didn't directly engage with Ghazali's texts, his ideas might have been circulating indirectly through the broader cultural and political context. It's a complex web of influences.
so Al-Ghazali, another key figure in this intellectual puzzle. Okay, we've done a really good job of laying out the intellectual landscape here. Those key players, those big ideas that are floating around. Now let's dive into some specifics. We said we'd start with God's nature, right? Where do we see that Islamic influence most clearly in Maimonides' understanding of God?
Well, one of the most prominent areas of influence, a key concept for any philosopher interested in metaphysics, is in that understanding of God's absolute simplicity and radical unity. Drawing heavily from the Islamic Neoplatonic tradition, Maimonides conceives of God as the purest, the most unlimited being imaginable. So unified, so utterly one, that he completely transcends any kind of internal multiplicity or composition. This is an idea that's central to the theology of Aristotle, to those other Platonian texts we mentioned, like the Kalam fi Ma'd al-Khair, where God is described as pure being or being only. And it was also a significant concept in the theological systems of the Almohads and the Mutazilites.
So right there in the heart of the intellectual world that Maimonides was part of.
Exactly. It was a key idea that he inherited and then developed in his own unique way.
In this radical conception of divine unity, it leads directly to Maimonides' strong emphasis on what we call negative theology, right?
Precisely. If God is truly and absolutely one, then any positive attributes that we try to ascribe to him, based on our limited human understanding, they're always going to fall short. They can't fully capture his reality because they imply some kind of limitation, some kind of multiplicity within God, which this view rejects completely.
So it's not that God doesn't have qualities, it's that our limited human language, our categories of thought, just aren't adequate to describe him.
Exactly. Predication, the very act of saying God is this or God is that, it implies that the subject has this quality among many other possible qualities, which suggests limitation. But God, in his absolute unity, he transcends all of that. As Maimonides himself puts it, he, may he be exalted, is one in all respects. No multiplicity should be posited in him. There is no notion that is superadded to his essence.
So no qualities that are somehow added on to his being.
Exactly. And this resonates strongly with Al-Farabi, who really emphasizes God's oneness as his very essence. It's not just something he has, it's what he is. It's the fundamental characteristic that sets him apart ontologically from everything else.
So God's unity isn't like an attribute, right? It's not like one quality among others. It's the very ground of his being.
Exactly. And Avicenna, he develops this further. He describes God as the uniquely necessary existence,
Okay.
contrasting his essential unity with the composite nature of literally everything else.
So everything that exists, other than God, it's kind of a combination of different things.
Right. He's saying there's this fundamental distinction between what something is its essence and the fact that it happens to exist. For God, there's no such distinction. His essence is to exist. It's necessary. There's no possibility of him not existing.
It's a mind-bending idea for sure.
Avicenna is famous for this idea that existence is a quality that gets added to the essence of all those non-divine beings, right? It's a subtle point, but crucial.
Yeah.
And we see it echoed in Maimonides. He describes existence as an accident attaching to what exists. And he insists that there's no superadded notion to God's essence. His essence is simple, it's one, it's pure being.
So for everything other than God, there's this distinction between what it is, its essence, and the fact that it happens to exist. But for God, those two are the same.
Exactly. There's no separation, no distinction. Maimonides is very clear about this. God's existence is necessary. It's not contingent on anything outside of himself. He doesn't exist through existence. His very being is existence.
Okay, this is heavy stuff.
Mhm.
This is philosophy with a capital P. So we can't define God through those positive attributes, right?
Right.
But as philosophers, we still want to understand, to the extent that we can, what can we say about him? What's left?
This is where that idea of negative theology or apotheticism comes in. It's a big part of Maimonides' approach, and it has deep roots in those earlier philosophical traditions we've been talking about. Since God transcends our limited human categories, the most accurate way to approach him intellectually is to focus on what he is not.
To define him by negation.
Exactly. So, for example, Maimonides is adamant that we have to negate any notion of corporeality, any idea of a physical body when we're talking about God.
Okay.
We have to negate any kind of human-like emotions or affections. Because God is utterly simple and unified, he can't have attributes in the way we normally think of them. Any positive description we try to apply, it's ultimately going to be inadequate and misleading. In fact, it can actually make us more distant from a true understanding of the divine.
And Maimonides has this striking quote, right? Something about becoming more remote from God with each positive affirmation.
Yes, he says, know that when you make an affirmation ascribing another thing to him, you become more remote from him in two respects. One of them is that everything you affirm is a perfection only with reference to us, and the other is that he does not possess a thing other than his essence.
Okay, so two problems. First, those qualities that we see as perfections, they're only perfections from our limited human perspective. They don't necessarily apply to God.
Right.
And second, attributing those separate qualities to God, it implies this multiplicity, this kind of composition within his being, which is fundamentally at odds with the idea of his absolute unity.
Exactly. It's like trying to fit the ocean into a teacup. It just doesn't work. So when we encounter those seemingly positive attributes that are used to describe God in the Hebrew Bible, how do we reconcile those with this commitment to negative theology?
That's a great question. How does Maimonides, as both a philosopher and a religious scholar, square that circle?
He does it through a really sophisticated philosophical interpretation of Scripture. He says those biblical descriptions, they're not intended to be literal, precise descriptions of God's essence. Instead, they're pointing to the effects of his actions in the world. They're describing how we perceive those actions in terms of our own limited human categories of thought.
So, like when we talk about God's mercy, for instance, we're not saying that mercy is this separate attribute within God himself. We're talking about how his actions in the world appear to us.
Exactly. It's a matter of perspective. Maimonides gives this example of the intricate and incredibly well-ordered development of an embryo, which we might intuitively see as an expression of divine mercy, right?
Yeah.
But he says, no, that's not quite right. It's more accurate to understand it as a manifestation of God's essential wisdom and goodness as they're expressed in the natural order of things. And it's important to note that this kind of nuanced reading of Scripture, this idea of looking beyond the literal meaning, it has deep roots in the Islamic philosophical tradition. It wasn't something Maimonides invented out of whole cloth.
So it's a sophisticated way of reading those traditional religious texts through a philosophical lens.
Precisely, and it allows him to hold on to those core theological ideas about God's absolute unity and transcendence while still affirming the truth and the value of Scripture. It's a really remarkable intellectual balancing act.
It is. So we've talked about negative theology. Now this leads us to another fascinating aspect of Maimonides' thought, one that also has a strong connection to Islamic philosophy: the concept of God as intellect.
Right.
So how does this seemingly Aristotelian idea fit within this broader Neoplatonic framework we've been talking about?
It's a good question because it does seem like we're shifting gears a bit here, moving from this very abstract, almost mystical conception of God to something more concrete, more defined. But Maimonides, like many of his Islamic predecessors, manages to synthesize these different strands of thought in a really remarkable way. He describes God as this absolutely pure and indivisible unity, while at the same time affirming that God is a perfect, fully actualized intellect.
So both transcendent and possessing this quality of intellect.
Right, and this is where the contrast with our own human intellect comes in. Our intellect is limited. It's characterized by potentiality. We don't possess complete knowledge. We're always striving to learn and understand more. God's intellect, on the other hand, it's perfect.
Yeah.
It's complete. It's always in a state of full and total self-knowledge.
So from Maimonides, God's act of knowing, it's not something he does from time to time. It is his very essence. It's who he is. eternally.
Exactly. And we see this emphasis on God as this ultimate knower really clearly in Al-Farabi's work. He describes God as the first cause, the first intellect, and the first living. God is the source of all existence, all knowledge, all life itself.
That's a powerful image.
And Al-Farabi emphasizes God's unique status as being uncaused, possessing no unrealized potentiality, existing as pure actuality and necessary existence.
Okay, so building on that foundation, what does Maimonides do with it?
Well, he takes this basic idea of God as intellect, and he gives us a much more detailed and philosophically rigorous explanation of what that really means. What does it mean to say that God is intellect in actu in this state of pure actuality?
Okay, I'm all ears.
Maimonides says that if God is this pure, fully actualized intellect without any potentiality, then he and the object of his knowing, they have to be one and the same. There's no separation between the knower, the act of knowing, and the thing that is known. It's all completely unified within the singularity of God's being.
It's a mind-bending idea for sure.
It is. And we see the same idea articulated in Al-Farabi's work, where he describes God as the thinking subject who thinks himself, where intellect, thinker, and the intelligible all have the same meaning and are one essence. And even Averroes, although he differs from Maimonides and Al-Farabi on some pretty significant points, he also emphasizes God's purity of act as the prime mover, as this eternal substance, pure actuality, completely free from matter. So despite their differences, there's this fundamental agreement on this point.
It's fascinating how these different thinkers, even when they disagree on specifics, they're still working within this shared intellectual framework.
Absolutely. They're all grappling with these same big questions, building on the ideas of those who came before them, and trying to make sense of God, the world, and our place in it.
Okay, so we've got this concept of God as pure intellect, this perfect, self-knowing being. But there's also this emphasis on God's transcendence, this idea that he's ultimately beyond our comprehension.
Right.
How do these two ideas fit together? It seems like there might be some tension there.
That's a really insightful point. On the one hand, you've got this emphasis on God's immutability, his absolute otherness, his transcendence. But on the other hand, Maimonides describes God as the creator, the cause of all existence, which brings him into a much more intimate relationship with the universe.
So he's both utterly other and the source of everything.
Exactly. It's this dynamic tension between transcendence and immanence. And you see this tension playing out in different ways in the work of those Islamic thinkers we've been discussing. Al-Farabi and Avicenna, with their more fully developed theories of emanation, they emphasize this interplay maybe even more strongly than Averroes. And this tension reflects a broader debate within both Islamic and Jewish Neoplatonized thought, where they're trying to reconcile that Platonian idea of God as beyond being with the Aristotelian concept of God as this perfected, self-thinking intellect.
Okay, so there are these two strands of thought that they're trying to weave together. And where does Maimonides fall on this?
Well, we see affinities in his thought with both sides of this debate. Sometimes he describes God in these very immanent terms as the form of the world, as the mover of the first sphere. But then at other times, he really emphasizes God's radical transcendence, even beyond those other cosmic intellects in the emanated hierarchy. It's this delicate balancing act.
It's this tension that he's holding. Okay, so we've talked about God's nature, about these different influences on Maimonides' understanding of the divine. Let's shift gears a bit now and talk about the cosmos, about the act of creation and the structure of reality. How does Maimonides approach these issues, and how does he draw on those established Islamic traditions?
Well, Maimonides follows the lead of those Greek and Islamic philosophical traditions that came before him and undertakes a really meticulous investigation of the world. And by world, I mean not just the physical world, but the celestial realm and the metaphysical realm as well. It's this holistic view of reality.
So cosmology, astronomy, metaphysics, it's all connected.
Exactly. And remember that we talked earlier about those divine actions. Even the study of the physical world, of the way things work, it takes on a theological significance for Maimonides. It's not just about science for science's sake.
Right.
It's a way of understanding God's activities, his relationship to the world. It's a pathway to knowing God himself. As he famously puts it, there is no way to apprehend him except through the things he has made.
So studying nature is a way of studying God.
Precisely. Now, when it comes to the cosmos itself, it's clear that Maimonides sees God as the ultimate first cause, the source of all being. But what exactly that means, what that creation entails, is much more complicated and has been a subject of a lot of scholarly debate and diverse interpretations.
Okay, so we've got this big question here, a question that philosophers have been wrestling with for centuries. How does something come from nothing? How did the universe begin?
Exactly. And in the guide, Maimonides seems to present this view of creation, ex nihilo creation, out of absolutely nothing, as the accepted view of the Mosaic Law.
Okay.
But whether that represents his own definitive philosophical position, that's a much more complex question.
So is he really saying that he believes in creation ex nihilo? Or is he maybe being a bit more nuanced, leaving the door open to other interpretations?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And this is where that whole issue of esoteric writing comes in. Some scholars, following Leo Strauss, suggest that Maimonides might be deliberately concealing his true beliefs on these sensitive topics. Maybe he felt that it was too dangerous to explicitly challenge traditional religious views, so he couched his more radical ideas in this language that could be interpreted in different ways. Others point to certain ambiguities and inconsistencies within the guide itself, suggesting that maybe Maimonides hadn't fully worked out his position on these issues.
Okay, so it's possible he actually held a different view, maybe something closer to Aristotle's eternal universe or Plato's idea of creation from pre-existing matter.
It's certainly possible, and some scholars have made very compelling arguments for those alternative readings. The key point, I think, is that for Maimonides and his contemporaries, the term creation didn't always mean the same thing that it does for us today. It could encompass those Neoplatonic ideas of eternal emanation, where the cosmos is constantly flowing from the divine source. Or even a kind of modified Aristotelian eternity, where God is still recognized as the ultimate ground of being, but the universe itself has no temporal beginning.
So the word creation back then had this kind of broader range of meanings. It's not always about a specific point in time when everything began.
Exactly, and Ma.